The steel chain hung across the gate of my boat ramp on a Saturday morning, and taped beside it was a laminated sign that said the property had been seized for community safety. Celeste Harrow stood there with her arms crossed, smiling the way a person smiles when they believe they have already won. She told me a man who lived alone, who spent his days covered in engine grease, could not be trusted to manage something as important as the water access for an entire neighborhood. I did not argue with her that morning. I photographed the chain, the sign, and the 2 concrete planters someone had installed on either side of my driveway, and then I went inside and waited. 3 hours later, I heard a siren coming down the road, and a Coast Guard officer stood in front of that chain asking a question nobody in the crowd wanted to answer. Who had blocked emergency access to the water? My name is Nolan Keene, and I have spent 20 years fixing boat engines and repairing docks along Bellwether Bay. I live alone in a wood frame house that used to belong to my uncle, on a parcel of land that existed years before anyone drew the boundary lines for Cedar Wake Shores. The ramp behind my house drops into a shallow tidal creek that most people driving past would never notice, but the county has always known about it. Long before the Homeowners Association existed, that ramp was written into the emergency response plan as a backup launch point for shallow water rescue. I still own every inch of that land, but I signed on to keep a 30-foot corridor clear in case rescue crews ever needed it. It is not a complicated arrangement, and it never caused a single problem until Celeste Harrow decided she wanted it for herself. My uncle bought that parcel decades before any developer looked twice at Bellwether Bay, back when the shoreline was mostly marsh grass and fishing shacks instead of manicured lawns and vinyl fencing. He taught me how to rebuild an outboard motor before I could legally drive a car, and he taught me something else that turned out to matter more in the end, which was to keep every piece of paper that ever crossed my desk. When he passed, the house and the ramp came to me along with a filing cabinet full of surveys, permits, and letters that most people would have thrown away without a second glance. I never imagined I would need any of it to prove that I owned my own driveway, but habits my uncle drilled into me turned out to be worth more than any argument I could have made on my own. I kept working the same trade he had, repairing hulls and rebuilding engines for anyone along the bay who needed it, and I never gave much thought to the people building new houses on the other side of the tree line. Cedar Wake Shores went up gradually over the years, filling in the empty lots with rows of similar-looking homes, each one accompanied by a thick binder of rules about mailbox color and lawn height. I never joined the association because my land had never been part of it, a fact confirmed in writing decades before Celeste Harrow ever moved into the neighborhood. For a long time, that distinction meant nothing at all, since none of the earlier board presidents ever cared what I did on my own side of the property line. It was only after Celeste took over that the quiet arrangement between my family and that community began to feel less like an accident of history and more like something she considered a personal insult. I woke up that Saturday to the sound of a drill biting into concrete somewhere near the water, which is not a sound a man wants to hear before his coffee is finished. When I walked outside, I found a new metal gate bolted across the gravel drive that leads down to my ramp, a heavy padlock hanging from the latch, and a printed sign declaring the area under the authority of the Cedar Wake Shores Homeowners Association. Beneath that was a second notice warning that any vehicle without an association permit would be towed at the owner's expense. 2 concrete planters had been dropped on either side of the drive, narrowing the turning radius so badly that a truck pulling a boat trailer would have struggled to get through even without the gate. Celeste was standing beside a contractor named Gavin Red, watching the work with the satisfaction of someone admiring a finished kitchen renovation. When I asked her what she thought she was doing, she told me the ramp had been placed under temporary association control for safety reasons, as though safety were a magic word that could rewrite a deed. I told her plainly that she was standing on my property, not hers, and that no association resolution could change what the county recorder's office had on file. She looked me over, from my grease-stained boots to my faded work shirt, and told me that owning a toolbox did not make a man qualified to manage valuable waterfront property. I did not raise my voice. I have found over the years that raising your voice only gives people like Celeste something to point to later. She seemed to interpret my silence as surrender, because she reached into a folder and handed me a printed notice of violation, giving me 24 hours to remove my small fishing boat from what she now called association grounds. I took the paper, thanked her for her time in a tone flat enough that she could not accuse me of hostility, and photographed the gate, the sign, the contractor's license plate, and the exact position of both planters. Celeste climbed into her car, looking pleased with herself, certain the matter was settled. It was only after she drove away that I noticed something far more troubling than the padlock hanging in front of me. The yellow metal marker that had been bolted to the post beside my ramp for as long as I could remember was gone, and that marker was not a sign of ownership at all. It was the official designation for an emergency access point. I had first met Celeste Harrow 8 months earlier, not long after she was elected president of the Homeowners Association, on a platform of raising property values and enforcing what she called community standards. The complaint started small enough that I almost didn't notice a pattern forming. She wanted my work truck moved from the front of my house because it did not match the aesthetic of the street, even though my property sat outside the association boundary entirely. She sent a letter demanding I repaint my storage shed in an approved color palette, followed by a noise complaint about power tools that I only ever used during daylight hours. Each time I produced the paperwork proving my parcel had never belonged to the association, she would nod politely and then find a new angle within a matter of weeks. She had a particular way of speaking to me that made it clear she believed my work with my hands disqualified me from serious conversation. At an open community meeting where I tried once more to explain the boundary, she told the room that Cedar Wake Shores could not be run by a man who thought the size of his wrench determined who was right. Nobody laughed as hard as she expected, but nobody defended me either. And I have never been the kind of person who needs a room full of strangers to agree with him. My calm only seemed to frustrate her further, because she could never manufacture the outburst she needed to turn public opinion fully against me. Instead, she settled into a slower campaign, one email and one committee vote at a time, chipping away at what she assumed was my patience rather than my paperwork. She had other names for me too, ones she never used in front of the full board, but that filtered back to me through neighbors who felt uncomfortable repeating them. She called me the boat fixer once during a private conversation, overheard by a man 2 houses down, as though a trade could stand in for a name. Another time she referred to me as the fellow living out by the swamp, though the water behind my house was no more a swamp than the marina where half her guests kept their sailboats. She seemed to believe that a man who spent his days elbow-deep in engine oil could not possibly understand how a well-run community was supposed to function, and she said as much in different words nearly every time we crossed paths. I never bothered correcting her choice of language, mostly because I understood that arguing about the words she used would only give her another way to make me look thin-skinned in front of people who barely knew either of us. In recent weeks, the association had begun promoting an ambitious new amenity, a sunset walking path and a private kayak launch reserved exclusively for residents. The marketing photographs used for this campaign were taken from the exact spot where my boat ramp meets the water, framed to suggest the land already belonged to the association. I sent an email asking that my property be removed from any promotional material, and Celeste never responded directly. Instead, she wrote in the community newsletter that a single selfish resident was standing in the way of progress for the entire neighborhood, without naming me, though everyone on that street knew exactly who she meant. After checking the tide charts with my old friend Owen Pike, who runs the boat repair yard 2 miles down the shoreline, I learned something that made the whole situation heavier than a dispute over a walking path. The public launch at Bellwether Marina was closed for seawall repairs and would stay closed for at least another 2 weeks, which meant my ramp had quietly become the fastest usable water access anywhere on that stretch of the bay. Owen also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the Weather Service had issued a small craft advisory for later that afternoon, with a fast-moving line of thunderstorms expected to roll across the bay by evening. I thanked him and hung up, but something about the timing bothered me enough that I walked back out to the gate to look at it again. The 2 concrete planters were not just cosmetic obstacles meant to annoy me. Positioned exactly where they were, they choked the width of the access road down to something no rescue vehicle could reasonably navigate. I stood there running the measurements in my head, and Owen's question from a moment earlier came back to me with a weight I hadn't given it before. He had asked, almost joking, whether they had gone and blocked the emergency corridor too. Looking at those planters, I understood that Celeste Harrow had not simply locked me out of my own driveway. She had, without knowing it or perhaps without caring, closed off the fastest route any rescue crew had to reach boats in trouble on that part of the bay. I went inside and pulled a metal document box down from the closet shelf, the same box my uncle had left behind along with the house. Inside were the original deed to the parcel, a boundary survey from 1989, a signed agreement establishing the emergency access corridor with the county, an official map marking my ramp as a designated backup launch site, and a letter from years earlier confirming in writing that the Homeowners Association held no ownership or management authority over the access road. The agreement was simple enough that even a first-year law student could follow it. I owned the land outright and controlled exclusive use of it under normal conditions, but I had agreed to keep a 30-foot corridor clear at all times, so that emergency responders could reach the water quickly if they were ever called to use it. In exchange, the county had agreed to cover repair costs if the ramp was ever damaged during an actual rescue operation. I walked back outside with a tape measure and confirmed what I already suspected. The distance between the 2 new planters came out to just under 14 feet, nowhere close to the width a truck would need to back a boat trailer through safely. I called the county emergency management office, but being a weekend, all I reached was a voicemail greeting. I left a detailed message anyway, attached my photographs to a follow-up email, and marked it urgent, though I had no real way of knowing whether anyone would see it before Monday. While I waited to hear back, I spread every document from that metal box across my kitchen table and read through them a second time, slower than before, checking dates and signatures against everything I remembered from years of dealing with county offices. The survey had been stamped and recorded properly. The emergency corridor agreement carried the seal of the county clerk and a case number I could reference if anyone questioned its validity. Nothing in that pile left any room for interpretation, which made Celeste's confidence all the more strange to me, since a person who actually believed she held the stronger legal position rarely needed to move so fast to erase the evidence against her. Then I drafted a formal notice to Celeste, laying out 4 simple points. The ramp was private property. The gate had been installed without my permission. The emergency corridor had been physically obstructed. She needed to unlock the gate and clear the obstruction immediately. Her reply came back within minutes, faster than I expected for a Saturday afternoon. She claimed my documents were outdated and warned me not to attempt cutting the lock myself, reminding me that the gate itself was now association property regardless of what sat beneath it. She closed her message by suggesting that I would benefit from letting people with actual management experience make decisions, rather than reacting like a man whose ego had been bruised. I saved a screenshot of the entire exchange, forwarded it to the association treasurer, a woman named Dana Whitlock, and asked whether the board had ever formally approved construction on that section of the road. Dana called back within the hour, her voice noticeably tighter than usual, explaining that the board had never voted on any gate installation. Worse than that, she admitted she had no idea where the money to pay a contractor had even come from. Celeste called an emergency meeting right there at the ramp that same afternoon, gathering a handful of board members and a group of residents who tended to agree with whatever she proposed. She stood in front of that new gate as though she were cutting a ribbon at a grand opening, announcing that securing the ramp was a victory for both safety and neighborhood property values. I brought my survey documents with me, but she cut me off before I could lay them out in full, redirecting the conversation toward my supposed instability rather than the facts sitting in my hands. It became clear fairly quickly that she wanted the crowd to see a man unwilling to take direction from a woman in charge, rather than a landowner asking a simple question about jurisdiction. I refused to take that bait, and instead asked her 3 direct questions in front of everyone present. I asked whether the association held any recorded ownership of that parcel. I asked on what date the board had voted to approve construction of the gate. I asked who had given the order to remove the emergency access marker from its post. Celeste did not answer any of the 3 questions directly, choosing instead to accuse me of trying to undermine her leadership and turn a simple property matter into a personal attack against her. I reminded her, as calmly as I could manage, that property ownership does not shift based on the gender of whoever happens to be holding the key. Dana asked for the paperwork behind the contractor's payment, and Celeste responded that spending decisions like this one fell under what she called emergency executive authority, a phrase I doubt existed anywhere in the association bylaws. My phone rang in the middle of that exchange, and I stepped away to answer it. It was Marla Sutton from the county's emergency management office, calling back after hearing my earlier voicemail. She confirmed without hesitation that my ramp remained an active part of the county's official response plan, and she told me something that made the hair on my arms stand up. 2 weeks earlier, her office had sent a formal letter to the Homeowners Association reminding them that the public marina was closed for repairs and that my ramp needed to remain fully clear as the nearest functional access point. Celeste had clearly overheard part of that call because her face tightened, yet she still refused to hand over the key or agree to remove the planters. Out over the water, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the horizon, low and distant but unmistakable. My phone buzzed again, this time with a short message from Owen. 2 fishing boats that had gone out that morning had not returned to the marina, and the wind was pushing hard enough to drive them toward the shallow, muddy stretch of water near the mouth of the creek. I looked past the crowd still arguing near the gate and out toward the darkening sky, and, for the first time that day, the dispute in front of me felt small compared to what might be coming. The wind picked up fast after that, turning the surface of the bay a flat, angry gray within a matter of minutes. Rain began hammering the roof and cutting visibility down to almost nothing out past the shoreline. Owen called again, his voice clipped and urgent, saying one of the 2 overdue boats had managed to send a distress signal before its engine died somewhere near the northern mudflats. The Coast Guard's primary response vessel drew too much water to navigate that shallow creek safely, which meant the rescue team would need to launch a flat-bottomed boat pulled by a specialized trailer instead. My ramp sat closer to that stretch of water than any other usable launch point on the bay. I went straight back to the gate and asked Celeste for the key. She was still gathering papers from the meeting and told me, without any real urgency in her voice, that she could not open the gate without a formal written request, a signed liability waiver protecting the association, and confirmation that I would personally cover any damage that occurred. I told her plainly that this had stopped being a conversation about neighborhood rules the moment a distress call went out over open water. She looked at me and said that I had always assumed engine noise, and a few men in uniforms would be enough to strip away her authority. She climbed into her car, but did not leave, apparently determined to stand there and prove that nobody could get past that gate without her explicit permission. Within a few minutes, I heard sirens coming down the road. A Coast Guard truck pulling a rescue boat rolled into view, followed closely by a vehicle from the county's emergency management office. Both had to stop short of the chain blocking my driveway. Chief Petty Officer Reed Callahan stepped out, studied the gate, the planters, and the bare post where the yellow marker used to hang, then asked me directly whether this was Bellwether Access Point 3. I confirmed that it was, and handed him the map and documents I had already gathered earlier that day. He turned toward the small crowd of residents still lingering nearby, his eyes settling on Celeste Harrow standing near the gate with the keys hidden somewhere behind her. He pointed at the padlock and asked, in a voice that was calm but left no room for evasion, exactly who had ordered this emergency access point blocked. Nobody answered right away. Celeste slowly moved her hand behind her back, the ring of keys disappearing from view as though hiding them might somehow undo the question. Celeste stepped forward and tried to regain control of the moment, insisting the ramp belonged to the association and that any outside agency needed prior authorization before crossing onto what she still called association property. Callahan asked her directly whether she was the one who had ordered the gate installed. Instead of answering, she pivoted to accusing me of having a long history of conflict with the association, suggesting almost openly that I might have engineered this entire crisis simply to embarrass her in front of her neighbors. I pulled up footage from my own security camera on my phone and let it play for everyone standing there. It showed Gavin Redd's truck arriving early that morning, Celeste pointing to the exact spot where the gate should go, and her own hands removing the yellow emergency marker from its post before setting it aside in the bed of the truck. Callahan ordered her to unlock the gate immediately, and she still tried to insist that the Coast Guard sign a liability waiver before crossing onto the property. Marla Sutton arrived on the scene at almost that exact moment and informed everyone present that the emergency corridor had already been formally activated under the county's response plan, which meant Celeste had no authority left to delay anything further. Callahan finally gave the order to cut the chain. I offered my own bolt cutters, but let his crew handle the actual work, mindful that Celeste would happily accuse me of destroying association property if given the smallest opening. The gate swung open, but the planters still narrowed the path enough that the trailer carrying the rescue boat could not make the turn cleanly. Rain came down in sheets by then, hard enough that I had to shout to be heard over it, and the headlights of the truck cut two narrow beams through the downpour as the driver inched forward. I guided him through the tight space, one careful section at a time, watching the rear tire come within inches of the drainage ditch, running alongside the drive, my hand raised the whole time to signal when to stop and when to creep ahead another few inches. Every second felt heavier than it should have, knowing two men were somewhere out on that water with no engine and a storm closing in around them. Two of the crew members had to use a hand winch to shift one of the planters just enough to widen the gap, working fast with the kind of practiced efficiency that told me they had faced worse obstacles than a homeowners association gate. The entire process cost 11 minutes that never should have been lost in the first place. 11 minutes that Callahan's team would later note down to the second in an official report. The rescue boat finally hit the water, and Callahan's team pushed off into the rain, heading toward the mudflats where the stranded fishermen were waiting, their running lights disappearing into the gray almost as soon as they cleared the ramp. Celeste tried telling the remaining residents that the situation had been handled and that the short delay hardly mattered in the end. Marla, however, was already writing down the exact timestamps, photographing the obstruction, and collecting the names of everyone who had witnessed the standoff at the gate. Before climbing back into her vehicle, she handed me a copy of the letter her office had sent to the association 2 weeks earlier, warning them not to obstruct that corridor under any circumstances. At the bottom of that letter, in the space reserved for acknowledgement of receipt, was a signature belonging to Celeste Harrow herself. She could no longer claim ignorance of an access point she had signed for with her own hand. The rest of us waited near the ramp while the storm continued to churn overhead, none of us knowing yet what condition the two fishermen were in out on the water. Celeste spent those tense minutes on her phone instead, calling board members one after another and instructing them not to speak with anyone from the county or the press, without routing every question through her first. Nearly 40 minutes passed before the rescue boat finally reappeared through the rain, carrying both men back toward the ramp. They were cold, soaked through, and clearly exhausted, but conscious and able to walk on their own once the crew helped them ashore, having simply been pushed into the shallow mud by the wind with no way to restart their stalled engine. Callahan mentioned, almost in passing, that if his crew had been forced to detour to a different launch point entirely, the delay could have added another 30 minutes or more to the rescue. Celeste, hearing this, immediately shifted her story again, now claiming that I had personally agreed to let the association manage the ramp and had even requested the gate myself to keep strangers away. I pulled up the full email chain on my phone, months of correspondence in which I had repeatedly and clearly objected to any construction near my property. Not long after, Dana Whitlock arrived carrying a folder of association financial records. Having spent the last hour combing through recent transactions, she had discovered that Celeste authorized a transfer of $18,400 out of the association's stormwater repair fund to pay Gavin Redd's contracting company. The invoice description was almost laughably specific once Dana read it aloud. It listed a security gate near the waterfront, 2 reinforced landscaping planters, a homeowners association ownership sign, and a separate line item for removal of an outdated warning marker. Celeste attempted to justify the transfer by claiming that board presidents held discretionary authority to reallocate funds during emergencies. Dana pointed out, without raising her voice, that the second approval signature required on any expenditure of that size did not belong to her, and appeared instead to have been copied from an older, unrelated document. What had started as a property dispute over a locked driveway had quietly become something far more serious. I realized standing there in the aftermath that this had never really been about neighborhood safety at all. Celeste had used homeowner association funds to seize a piece of land that never belonged to her, then tried to erase the one detail that proved that land carried a legal obligation to remain open for emergencies. Callahan informed the group before leaving the scene that his official incident report would document every relevant detail with complete accuracy. It would record who had been notified in advance, who had physically held the key, who had refused repeated requests to open the gate, and exactly how long the rescue had been delayed as a direct result. For the first time since I had known her, Celeste Harrow did not smile. 3 days later, the county scheduled a formal site inspection to settle the boundary question once and for all. Present that morning were myself, Celeste, along with the association's attorney, Marla Sutton, representing emergency management, a licensed county surveyor, Dana, and 2 other board members, and a representative from the Coast Guard station. Metal stakes went into the ground one by one along the true property line, and the survey results confirmed something that should have ended the entire dispute weeks earlier. Not only the ramp itself, but the entire access road leading down to it sat completely within my parcel. The association's actual boundary ended nearly 12 feet short of where that gate had been installed. Celeste had directed her contractor to cross well beyond any line she could legitimately claim, drilling gate posts directly into private land and erecting a false ownership sign in the process. The emergency access agreement was confirmed as well, still fully valid, predating the Homeowners Association by nearly 2 decades and never once formally revoked by either party. The association's attorney attempted to argue that years of informal landscaping maintenance around the area might have established some kind of implied management right over time. I responded by producing repair invoices, photographs of ramp maintenance stretching back over a decade, and property tax records showing that I had been the only person ever paying to maintain that stretch of land. Dana then produced another document that changed the tone of the meeting entirely, a glossy real estate marketing brochure Celeste had recently prepared for prospective buyers, touting a private resident-only boat launch opening that summer. Celeste had never intended to fix a safety problem with that gate. She intended to seize control of a piece of land she did not own, charge residents an annual access fee to use it, and quietly raise property values across the development using an amenity that was never hers to offer in the first place. The gate had nothing to do with safety from the very beginning. The association's attorney fell quiet once the brochure was passed around the group, flipping through pages that described private waterfront access as though it were already a settled amenity rather than a project built entirely on land that did not belong to the organization selling it. One of the board members asked Celeste outright whether she had known the ramp sat outside association boundaries when she approved the brochure for printing, and for the first time that morning she offered no answer at all. The surveyor packed up his equipment quietly, clearly uninterested in the politics playing out around him. But before he left, he mentioned that his office would be filing the updated boundary documentation with the county by the end of the week, making the true property line a matter of permanent public record. Before the group dispersed, the county surveyor pointed to a small detail on the corner of his printed map that none of us had noticed until that moment. One of the concrete planters Celeste had installed did not simply sit on private land. It sat directly on top of a control valve for the neighborhood's stormwater drainage system, the very system meant to prevent flooding across dozens of yards throughout Cedar Wake shores. If the coming summer brought another storm anywhere near the strength of the one that had already tested that ramp once, entire sections of the neighborhood risked standing water they had never experienced before. The Homeowners Association called a special meeting at the clubhouse the following week, and the room filled quickly with residents, many of whom had spent months believing I was the difficult one causing unnecessary trouble. Celeste still took her usual seat at the head of the table and tried running the meeting as though nothing unusual had happened. She opened by claiming that I was exploiting a rescue incident to attack a strong female leader who had only ever tried to protect the community. I let the comment pass without response, and instead laid out the evidence in careful order, one document after another, refusing to let the conversation drift back toward anything personal. I presented the original deed, the boundary survey confirming the true property line, the signed emergency corridor agreement, the email exchange in which I had repeatedly asked her to unlock the gate, the county letter she had personally signed for 2 weeks earlier, security footage showing her removing the emergency marker herself, the contractor invoice paid from stormwater repair funds, and the marketing brochure advertising an amenity she never had any right to offer. Dana followed by informing the room that the association's insurance carrier could potentially deny coverage entirely, given that construction had taken place outside the recorded boundary, while the true purpose of the spending had been deliberately concealed from the board. Reed Callahan had agreed to attend and speak briefly about the rescue itself. He avoided taking any side in the neighborhood politics and simply read the timeline aloud exactly as it had been logged. From the moment his crew arrived at the blocked gate to the moment the rescue boat finally reached open water, 11 minutes had been lost. He turned to Celeste and repeated the same question that had first silenced her at the ramp that stormy afternoon, asking why, after having personally signed for a letter warning her not to obstruct emergency access, she had still given the order to block it anyway. Celeste attempted to shift the blame onto her contractor, but Gavin Red had already submitted a written statement along with the signed invoice bearing her own approval. He confirmed she had specifically instructed him to remove the yellow marker because, in her words, it made the area look like an industrial boatyard rather than a private community amenity. By that point, nobody in the room stepped forward to defend her any longer. The board voted that same evening to suspend her from the presidency, ordered a full audit of every association expenditure from the previous year, and agreed to forward the falsified signature on the contractor invoice to the appropriate authorities for review. A few residents who had spent months siding with Celeste out of habit rather than conviction approached me afterward, several of them apologizing for repeating claims they now realized had never been true. One older man who lived 3 doors down admitted he had believed Celeste's version of events entirely, assuming a man who worked with his hands for a living simply lacked the patience to deal with paperwork and procedure. I told him there was nothing to apologize for, since Celeste had built her entire case on the assumption that nobody would ever bother checking the county records for themselves. It was easier, I said, to believe a well-dressed woman standing behind a podium than to imagine she might be lying about something as fundamental as a property line. As the meeting broke up, Celeste caught up to me in the hallway outside the clubhouse. She suggested, almost casually, that the association could still allow me to continue using my own boat ramp if I agreed to quietly drop the entire complaint. I looked at her for a long moment before answering, and asked whether she still genuinely believed she had ever been the one granting me permission to use land that had belonged to my family long before her association even existed. The audit that followed confirmed everything Dana had already uncovered on her own that stormy afternoon. Celeste had transferred association funds without proper authorization, used a copied signature to fake a second approval, and deliberately withheld the true nature of the expense from the rest of the board. She was formally removed from the presidency and barred from holding any officer position within the association going forward. The board agreed to a full set of corrective actions in the weeks that followed. They would remove the gate and both planters at the association's own expense, restore the emergency access marker to its original post, reimburse me for the cost of repairing the section of driveway damaged during the rescue, send written confirmation that my parcel had never belonged within association boundaries, cancel the planned resident-only boat launch program entirely, and refund every homeowner who had already paid a reservation fee toward that program. I never asked the association to dissolve itself, and I never wanted to see ordinary neighbors punished financially for decisions made without their knowledge. All I asked was that the boundary be respected going forward and that the emergency corridor never be obstructed again under any circumstances. Under a new arrangement worked out with the county, a lightweight gate was installed at the top of the road, mainly to discourage strangers from wandering down uninvited. I hold the primary key to that gate myself. The Coast Guard and county emergency responders were each given their own lockbox access. The gate itself uses a quick release mechanism, and no obstruction of any kind is ever permitted within the 30-foot corridor again. A few weeks after everything settled, the county organized a training drill along that same stretch of shoreline. A truck pulling a rescue boat came down the access road and reached open water in a matter of minutes without a single obstacle in its path, the whole exercise finishing faster than anyone on scene had expected. Reed Callahan thanked me afterward for holding on to my old paperwork and for choosing to wait for proper authorities instead of cutting that chain myself out of frustration. Had I acted rashly that first afternoon, Celeste might well have succeeded in painting me as the reckless one, rather than the man who had simply been protecting what was rightfully his. He told me most disputes like this one never resolved as cleanly, because most people facing a locked gate reached for bolt cutters before they ever reached for a filing cabinet, and by the time the truth came out, nobody was interested in listening anymore. Owen stopped by not long after the drill, leaning against my truck the way he always did when he wanted to talk without making it feel like a conversation. He asked whether I felt any satisfaction watching Celeste's name stripped off the association letterhead, and I told him the honest answer was less than he probably expected. There was no pleasure in watching a neighbor lose her position, even one who had spent months trying to convince an entire community that I was somehow less capable simply because of how I earned my living. What mattered to me was simpler than any kind of personal victory, the knowledge that the next time a storm rolled in off the bay, nothing would stand between a rescue crew and the water that needed them. Celeste eventually put her house up for sale, though she remained in the neighborhood a while longer before finally moving on. Each time she drove past my property during those final weeks, she would have seen the freshly restored marker standing exactly where it always belonged, reading Bellwether Access Point 3, "Keep clear at all times." I think about that morning often, standing at the edge of my ramp listening to the sound of an engine fading somewhere out on the bay. I never felt like I had won simply because Celeste lost her position within the association. I felt like I had won because no lock, no title, and no condescending smile could ever quietly rewrite the truth of who actually owned that piece of land. Celeste once believed that whoever controlled the key controlled the road beneath it. But the day the Coast Guard came looking for answers, she learned a harder lesson instead, that a padlock proves only one thing in the end, that somebody tried to close a gate the law had always required to stay open.